How can we do deformations in shader graph? It's really pretty simple.
All we need to do is start taking a look at a texture and start realigning that texture by putting another texture in between so that we can reshape the UV map as a texture so that we can paint the original texture into different spots on the model. You can think of it as just taking one texture you're going to paint, putting another texture in between, and then repositioning that.
What? It's really not that difficult. We're just using a fragment shader in shader graph. We're going to sample a pixel from the texture. It draws the texture exactly as the square texture or rectangular texture it was to begin with. So when you look at this and we see red and green, X and Y, that's just a way to visualize this. You can literally just take a texture and put the texture there to get a generally functional UV mapping. Let's tie this up. Just tying this in here, it's got the exact same structure. Unity also has some other UV maps. For instance, over here, we have twirl. So I'm going to drag twirl over, and you can see the yellows, greens, and reds in this spiral pattern. So we should see our texture preview spiral. And it does. I can adjust the strength so we get different variations, and the closer it is to 0, the more it looks like the original image. Now, there's also other ones in here, so let's grab this, move it over. I can just drag that in there to UV, and this looks mostly the same. I can adjust both separately with this one. The radial shear will let you do this in opposite directions for X and Y, and shift each of them in whatever direction you want. A key thing to look at this, you can see what's happening here. It's hard to read the tiling because with the tiling, you're starting to go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, etc. And the colorings on here only show you up to 1. We can look at the difference and see how that works out. The twirl was really obvious. So when I was adjusting the twirl, you really saw that and could read that difference. So you can look at other ones. But what about this one up here? Look at that. That's called polar coordinates. That is a different way of looking at this. I'm going to map that one into here. Now let's take a look at how this one works. I'm going to drag that over and we're going to adjust the strength. And then let's go to length strength. Oh, why would they provide this kaleidoscope by default? This is used for 360-degree video. So there's a bunch of these that you can start messing with that just came from Unity by default. But I'm not going to use those for what I'm doing here. I want to dive into another way of looking at it. That UV map, let's think of it as a texture. We can manipulate reds and greens. Oh, let me wire this up. So let's go over to here. I have this. Drag that to there, and then down here, we're going to drag you to this, so I'm remapping the shader. We've got our image showing up, but the center of it's kind of distorted. But you see the UV over here, the UV is normal everywhere, but then in the center, it's kind of distorted. Those pixels, as we move them, will move the rest of the image on where it shows up. All right, so how does this texture work? How do we get this image to manipulate here? Well, we start out with this texture, this gradient sphere of black and white. So white on the edges, and we multiply it by another value. Eventually, we multiply it so much that even the black, which by the way isn't fully black, about 166 that we get all white out of this. And then it adds this texture. So since it's adding any value, if this has a 0.5 and this is 0.5, the value we'll get is 1. If this is 80, and this is 0.5, we'll get 80.5. Then we add those, and then we clamp it down to 1. So anything that's over 1, it just locked down. It doesn't matter how much it gets used, because we are multiplying this one by quite a lot. And when remember, we get the tiling if we don't clamp these things. So I could actually just drag this down to here, and then we get lots and lots of tiling. Let's adjust the value. You can see it starts coming in, and this texture I'm using because it gives me this interesting effect. So in this case, it makes it look more like glass that's damaged and burned on the outside. So as I change the value, you kind of see like this glass that we're looking through. It's kind of a cool effect. So let's take a look at another one. I'm going to come down to here and let's remap this RGB into here. And that's primarily so we can see this through the main preview. As I look over here, we have even more image editing, but what's interesting about this one, let me move the slider down, let me max it out. I just marked the areas in white that we want to keep. So when I'm changing this value, everything around it is getting changed. All right, so below this one, we're just cutting out a piece of it. So we have kind of a different explosion effect. So greens over here, reds over here, kind of some in-between variants over here, blacks over here. So the direction that they move is more locked. So we can use the textures to change how these things move. If you just want to do some interesting, messy effects, you can jump into this and throw in almost anything. Let's change out this texture with, where is this? Let's go with devious. This one. Look at that. That looks like fun. And we have a very different effect of how it works. You just throw in images and mess around with it and see what comes. All right, so now let's get over to this one. This is the one that we were leaving off on. I'm just going to drag that over to here so we wire it into the main preview. So we've got this one, and this is using something called Voronoi. Over here, Voronoi is just basically this cell bubble thing. And if I got rid of that connection, if I just manipulate this number, if I go to 0, it's just a square grid. So Voronoi is basically just taking this grid of gradient bubbles and re-angling some of them. Now, it also has a cellular output. So if I take the cellular output, that brings it over to here, which actually, let's just do this. Add. And go to there. And on this side, there. Perfect. Add it to 0. We see the cellular output where it just takes each one of these cells to the point where one gradient maxes out and starts reaching the start of the next gradient. So when we combine that, we end up combining it with the original UV channel, and it gives us this effect, which effectively just takes any polygon from here and shifts where that polygon is pulling from. And it does it pretty evenly. The other thing that's happening is this angular offset. I'm just controlling that with time. So it starts moving on its own, and that's that final effect. The movement on its own is pretty straightforward. We just take time, we multiply time by some odd value so we can make it go faster. Let's go up to 6. There we go. That means it's going to fluctuate 6 times per second. So we get our sine value out of this. We pull sine out of this and put that into add. So the add is so we can set the angular offset. Because remember, the closer we are to 0, the more we see that square grid. So if I make sure that it's offset to begin with by like 10 or something, then we never really see the square grid come back. And that's it. That's how we get our shader.